Elena Rodriguez was 12 years old when she attended her first circus and refused to applaud. While other children screamed with delight as the lion jumped through flaming hoops and balanced on platforms that seemed impossibly small for his massive body, Elena sat perfectly still in her seat, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed not on the spectacle but on something that made her stomach turn with a feeling she was too young to name but old enough to recognize as deeply, fundamentally wrong. She saw the pain in the lion's eyes, saw the way he flinched every time the ringmaster cracked his whip with a sound like gunfire echoing through the tent, saw the mechanical quality of his movements that spoke not of training but of something closer to broken submission that came from years of punishment and fear. The other children saw entertainment, magical moments they would remember fondly for years to come, but Elena saw suffering dressed up in sequins and spotlights and circus music, and in that moment, sitting in a crowded tent that smelled of popcorn and animal waste and sawdust, she made a promise to herself that would define the next 33 years of her life and shape every major decision she would make from that day forward. She would grow up, and she would dedicate her life to saving every single circus lion she could find, and she would never stop until every cage was empty and every whip was broken and every animal who had been exploited for human entertainment was living in safety and dignity. 33 years later, at the age of 45, on her 89th raid of an illegal circus operation conducted with local law enforcement and wildlife authorities, Elena stood in front of a cage that held something she had been searching for her entire adult life without quite realizing it until this moment when past and present collided with devastating clarity. The creature inside was technically a lion, male, approximately 17 years old according to the veterinary records she would later obtain through legal channels, but he barely resembled the magnificent predators she had seen in documentaries about African wildlife filmed in the Serengeti and Kruger National Park, or even the broken animals she had rescued from other circuses over the years during operations that spanned multiple countries and continents. This lion was skeletal, his ribs visible through skin that hung loose where muscle should have been padding his frame, his once golden coat now dull and patchy from malnutrition and stress and the kind of systematic neglect that spoke of owners who viewed him as nothing more than a broken piece of equipment no longer worth maintaining or repairing. His mane, which should have been full and dark and impressive enough to attract females and intimidate rival males, was thin and graying and falling out in places, giving him the appearance of something ancient and used up and discarded by both time and human cruelty in equal measure. But it was his eyes that stopped Elena in her tracks and made her forget for a moment about the 9 other animals she needed to document and evacuate from this facility before the police finished processing the circus owners and the window for rescue closed and the animals were seized as evidence or sold to pay legal fees. Those eyes, which should have been fierce and golden and alive with the kind of intelligence that made lions one of nature's most successful predators, instead held something she had never quite seen in all her years of animal rights work spanning 2 decades, in all the hundreds of abused creatures she had helped relocate to sanctuaries and rehabilitation centers across North America and Europe. It was not just pain or fear or the blank resignation that came from years of captivity in conditions that violated every standard of animal welfare. It was something that looked like hope that had been killed and buried so long ago that only a ghost remained, a faint echo of what this animal might have been if the world had been kinder and humans had been better and life had offered him even one moment of genuine freedom or joy or purpose beyond performing tricks for crowds who did not care whether he lived or died as long as he entertained them for 15 minutes before they moved on to the next attraction. Elena knelt down in front of the cage, her knees hitting the concrete floor that was stained with years of waste and neglect, ignoring the protocol that said she should maintain distance until the animal was properly sedated and secured for transport, ignoring the voice in her head that sounded like her mentor Dr. Harrison warning her that getting emotionally involved with rescue cases was a path to burnout and heartbreak that had destroyed more activists than any amount of legal opposition or financial pressure. She looked into those damaged eyes and whispered something she had never said to any of the animals she had rescued before, because maintaining professional boundaries was important in this work and projecting human emotions onto creatures who operated primarily on instinct was a mistake that led to poor decision-making and inappropriate anthropomorphization. But in this moment, with this lion who looked like he had been dead for years except for the fact that his heart was still somehow beating and his lungs were still somehow pulling air, Elena found herself saying words that came from somewhere deeper than professional training or activist ideology or the carefully constructed walls she had built around her heart to survive 2 decades of witnessing animal suffering. "I am going to get you out of here," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the chaos of the raid happening around them with police shouting and animals calling and equipment being moved. "I promise you, I am going to give you the life you should have had from the beginning. You are going to know what freedom feels like, even if it is just for a little while, even if it is just at the end of everything. You deserve that much." You deserve so much more than that. You deserve everything they took from you. If you believe that every creature deserves a second chance regardless of their past or their scars, that no amount of suffering can completely destroy the capacity for connection and healing when someone is willing to be patient and present, then please subscribe to Lion King Stories. Every subscription helps us share more incredible true tales about the bonds that form between broken souls who refuse to give up on each other, stories that prove compassion is not weakness but the strongest force in the natural world and the only thing that can truly transform lives that have been devastated by cruelty. These stories matter more than ever in a world that often seems designed to harden our hearts, and your support helps us keep telling them to audiences who need to hear that redemption is always possible, that love can heal even the deepest wounds, and that it is never too late for someone to experience kindness for the first time. The lion they would come to call Freedom, though he would not learn his name for several weeks because names implied identity and value, and the circus had never bothered giving him anything except a number stamped on the rusted identification tag attached to his cage that read simply Lion 7. Was transferred that same night to the emergency veterinary facility that Elena's organization maintained specifically for exactly these situations where rescued animals required immediate medical intervention. The facility was located on the outskirts of the city in a warehouse district that provided privacy and security, designed to handle the urgent medical needs of rescued animals before they were moved to permanent sanctuary placements that could take weeks or months to arrange depending on availability and compatibility. The facility was equipped with surgical suites that met veterinary hospital standards, quarantine areas to prevent disease transmission, specialized housing for different species, and staff who had dedicated their careers to treating the kinds of injuries and illnesses that came from years of abuse and neglect and exploitation. Freedom required all of it, every resource the facility could provide, because the veterinary examination that took place within hours of his arrival revealed a catalog of horrors that made even the experienced staff members, who had seen terrible things in their years of rescue work, fall silent with something approaching grief and rage. His teeth had been filed down to prevent him from biting handlers during training sessions or performances, a practice that was technically illegal but remained common in circus operations because it made the animals easier to control, and the filing had been done so carelessly that several teeth were cracked or infected and nerves were exposed, causing chronic pain that Freedom had been living with for years without any kind of veterinary care or pain management. His claws had been removed entirely in what veterinarians called an onychectomy, not through the relatively humane surgical process that was sometimes used in domestic cats when deemed medically necessary, but through crude amputation that left his paws malformed and painful and made walking an ordeal he endured rather than an activity that should have been natural and effortless. His body was covered in scars that created a roadmap of abuse, some old and faded to silver lines against his tawny coat, others relatively recent and still pink and raised, telling a story of nearly 2 decades of systematic cruelty that included beatings and whippings and other forms of punishment designed to break his spirit and make him compliant. X-rays revealed multiple fractures in his legs and ribs and spine that had healed poorly because they were never properly set or treated, leaving him with chronic pain and limited mobility that would affect him for the rest of his life. Blood tests showed malnutrition so severe that his organs were beginning to shut down, his liver and kidneys showing damage that was typical of animals in the final stages of starvation, his immune system so compromised that he was vulnerable to infections that a healthy lion would easily fight off. The veterinarian who performed the initial assessment, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chin who had worked with Elena's organization for 8 years and thought she was beyond being shocked by the depths of animal cruelty after seeing everything from dog fighting operations to exotic pet trafficking, looked up from her examination with tears streaming down her face and said something that would haunt Elena for months and years afterward, words that captured the impossible nature of what they were witnessing. "I do not know how he is still alive," Sarah said quietly, her voice breaking with emotion she normally kept under professional control because falling apart in front of suffering animals helped no one. "By every medical standard I can apply, he should have died years ago." X-rays revealed multiple fractures in his legs and ribs and spine that had healed poorly because they were never properly set or treated, leaving him with chronic pain and limited mobility that would affect him for the rest of his life. Blood tests showed malnutrition so severe that his organs were beginning to shut down, his liver and kidneys showing damage that was typical of animals in the final stages of starvation, his immune system so compromised that he was vulnerable to infections that a healthy lion would easily fight off. The malnutrition alone should have killed him. The infections should have killed him. The accumulated trauma should have killed him. The fact that his heart is still beating and his lungs are still functioning is not biology or medicine or anything I learned in veterinary school. It is something else entirely. It is will. It is the refusal to let them win by dying and giving them the satisfaction. I have never seen anything like it in 20 years of practice. This lion has been surviving on sheer determination when his body had every reason to give up. Freedom spent 6 weeks in the veterinary facility, longer than any animal Elena had ever kept there, because the standard protocol was always to move rescues to sanctuary placement as quickly as possible to free up limited resources for new cases that arrived constantly from raids and confiscations. But Freedom was not ready for sanctuary placement, not physically and definitely not psychologically, because while his body was slowly healing with proper nutrition and medical care and the kind of veterinary attention he should have been receiving throughout his life, his psychological state was far more complicated and concerning than any of his physical injuries. He showed signs of severe post-traumatic stress that manifested in ways the staff had difficulty managing even with their extensive experience in animal behavior and rehabilitation. He would not eat unless someone was watching him, as if he had been trained through years of conditioning to believe that food was contingent on performance or approval from human handlers. He flinched violently at sudden sounds, particularly anything that resembled the crack of a whip or the slam of metal on metal or raised human voices. His entire body tensing and his breathing becoming rapid and shallow in ways that indicated he was reliving traumatic experiences. Most concerning to the behavioral specialists who evaluated him, he would not leave his enclosure even when the door was opened wide, and he was actively encouraged to explore the larger indoor rehabilitation space that had been set up specifically for his use, as if the concept of voluntary movement without permission or punishment was so foreign to his experience that he could not process it as a real possibility. Elena found herself spending hours every day sitting outside Freedom's enclosure, not doing anything active or interventive, just being present in a consistent and non-threatening way while he slowly learned to exist in a space where nothing bad happened to him, where food came regularly regardless of his behavior or performance, where humans moved slowly and spoke softly and never raised a hand or a whip or made the kinds of threatening gestures that had been part of his daily experience for 17 years. She would bring her laptop and do her administrative work there, answering emails and reviewing documents for upcoming raids and managing the complex logistics of running an animal rescue organization, creating a routine that she hoped would communicate stability and safety to an animal who had never experienced either in any meaningful way. Sometimes she would talk to him, not in the high-pitched encouraging voice that people often used with animals as if they were children or pets, but in her normal conversational tone, telling him about her day or her frustrations with bureaucratic obstacles or her memories of other rescues she had conducted over the years, sharing her life with him as if he was a friend rather than a damaged creature that needed fixing. She did not know if he understood the words or even registered her presence in any meaningful cognitive way, but it felt important to treat him as something more than a broken object that needed repair, to acknowledge his existence as valid and worthy of attention and respect even when he was not performing tricks or being useful or doing anything except simply existing in a space that was finally safe. The breakthrough in Freedom's rehabilitation came on a Tuesday morning during his 7th week at the facility, a moment that Sarah would later describe as one of the most significant behavioral observations she had witnessed in her entire career. Elena arrived early as she always did, bringing coffee and her laptop and the determination to maintain the routine that had become as important to her as it seemed to be for Freedom, and found him standing at the open door of his small enclosure, not entering the larger rehabilitation space but not retreating back into his cage either, simply standing at the threshold as if he was trying to gather courage for a step that felt impossible despite being physically simple. Elena stopped moving immediately and held her breath, afraid that any sound or motion might break whatever spell or internal process had allowed him to come this far, farther than he had ventured in 7 weeks of gentle encouragement. For nearly 20 minutes they stayed frozen in that tableau, woman and lion separated by 30 feet of concrete floor, both waiting for something neither could quite name but both recognized as significant. Then Freedom took one slow, deliberate step forward, his malformed paw touching the concrete beyond his cage door, crossing the boundary between his small safe enclosure and the larger space that represented the unknown. His entire body was trembling with what looked like profound terror, his breathing rapid and shallow as if he was preparing for punishment or attack, but he did not retreat or freeze. The sanctuaries her organization worked with were wonderful facilities, spacious enclosures designed by experts to mimic natural habitats, veterinary care provided by specialists who understood exotic animal medicine, enrichment programs developed by behaviorists, and most importantly the company of other rescued lions who could provide the social interaction and modeling that was crucial for psychological health and development. But Freedom was not going to adapt successfully to any of that because 17 years in a circus cage, 17 years of systematic abuse and social isolation and traumatic conditioning, had broken something in him that could not be fixed simply by giving him more space and better conditions and the company of his own species. He needed something else, something that Elena was only beginning to understand as she watched him explore his new environment with the hesitant steps of someone learning to walk after a lifetime of paralysis, something more individualized and intensive than even the best sanctuary could provide given their resource limitations and the number of animals they had to care for. He learned to eat without constantly looking around for handlers or waiting for explicit permission, though he still ate faster than was healthy for proper digestion, as if some part of him remained convinced that food could be taken away at any moment if he did not consume it quickly enough to prevent intervention. He learned to tolerate the presence of staff members besides Elena, though he never fully relaxed with them the way he seemed to with her, never approached them voluntarily or sought their attention the way he increasingly did with the woman who had made him promises in that circus cage. And slowly, almost imperceptibly to anyone not watching him every single day, he began to heal in ways that went far beyond physical recovery from malnutrition and untreated injuries. His eyes became more alert and engaged, tracking movement and responding to sounds with interest rather than fear, showing intelligence and awareness rather than the blank survival mode he had existed in for so long. His body language shifted from constant vigilance and tension and readiness for punishment to something that occasionally resembled peace or at least the absence of active suffering. He even began making sounds sometimes, not roars because he had been punished so severely for vocalizing that the behavior had been completely suppressed and might never fully return, but soft chuffs and low rumbles and quiet vocalizations that seemed to indicate contentment or at least comfort, the kinds of sounds that healthy lions make when they feel safe enough to communicate something other than distress or warning. The question of what to do with freedom long-term became increasingly urgent as months passed and turned into half a year, and it became undeniably clear that he was never going to be suitable for traditional sanctuary placement no matter how much time and resources were invested in his rehabilitation. Her board of directors was growing increasingly impatient with the delay, pointing out with completely reasonable logic that keeping freedom at the veterinary facility indefinitely was expensive and prevented them from taking in new rescues who desperately needed the space and medical care, animals who were currently suffering while freedom occupied resources that should be rotating to serve more animals. They were right. Elena knew they were absolutely right from an organizational efficiency standpoint, but she also knew with the same certainty that sending freedom to a sanctuary at this point would be signing his death warrant, just a death sentence that took longer to execute than a bullet but was no less final in its outcome. The solution to this seemingly impossible dilemma came from an unexpected source that Elena would later describe as a moment of grace when the universe aligned to provide exactly what was needed exactly when it was needed most. Dr. Sarah Chin, who had become Freedom's primary veterinary caregiver and who had developed her own powerful attachment to the elderly lion despite her best efforts to maintain professional distance, approached Elena one evening after most of the facility staff had gone home for the day. They sat in Elena's cluttered office, surrounded by filing cabinets full of documentation from decades of rescue operations, case files that represented thousands of animals saved and hundreds more they had not been able to reach in time, and Sarah said something that would change the trajectory of both Freedom's life and Elena's career in ways neither of them could have anticipated. "What if he could stay with you permanently?" Sarah asked quietly, choosing her words carefully because she knew this suggestion violated numerous protocols and would create complications neither of them wanted to face. "Not here at the facility where we need the space for acute cases, but at your property outside the city, the 5 acres you inherited from your mother last year." The solution to this seemingly impossible dilemma came from an unexpected source that Elena would later describe as a moment of grace when the universe aligned to provide exactly what was needed exactly when it was needed most. Dr. Sarah Chin, who had become Freedom's primary veterinary caregiver and who had developed her own powerful attachment to the elderly lion despite her best efforts to maintain professional distance, approached Elena one evening after most of the facility staff had gone home for the day. "You could build a proper enclosure there, something designed specifically for his needs and limitations, and he could live out whatever time he has left in a place where he feels safe with the one person he trusts most in the world. I know it is not conventional. I know the board will have serious concerns about liability and precedent. But Elena, he is 17 years old and he has been through absolute hell and he is never going to successfully adapt to sanctuary life with other lions. What he needs is not rehabilitation toward independent wild behavior. What he needs is hospice care, end-of-life comfort, spending his remaining time, whether that is months or years, somewhere he does not have to be afraid anymore, where he can just exist without the constant stress of adapting to new environments and new caretakers and new expectations." Elena spent 3 nearly sleepless nights considering this proposal from every angle she could think of, weighing it against everything she believed about proper animal care and the legitimate dangers of keeping wild animals on private property and the critical importance of maintaining professional boundaries that prevented activists from becoming hoarders who collected animals they could not adequately care for. She consulted with behavioral specialists who worked with traumatized exotic animals, with veterinarians who specialized in geriatric lion care, with legal experts who understood the complex regulations around exotic animal ownership and the permits required for different types of facilities. She ran detailed financial analyses to determine if she could realistically afford the ongoing costs of care that would include food, veterinary expenses, facility maintenance, liability insurance, and emergency preparedness for an animal that could live another 3 to 5 years if his health remained stable. She even tried to talk herself out of the idea by listing all the perfectly logical and valid reasons why this was a terrible proposal that would compromise her organization's mission and reputation and credibility in the animal welfare community. But every argument she constructed, no matter how sound or reasonable or grounded in practical concerns, crumbled and dissolved when confronted with one simple truth that she could not rationalize away or ignore or subordinate to policy considerations. Freedom needed her specifically, not just adequate care or appropriate facilities or the company of other lions, but the presence of the one human who had promised him a better life and who could not keep that promise by sending him somewhere that would terrify him all over again and undo everything he had fought so hard to overcome. The process of getting legal permission to keep a circus rescue lion on private property for hospice care took 4 frustrating months of paperwork and inspections and meetings with local authorities who were understandably nervous about having an adult male lion living in what was technically a residential area, even if that area was rural and agricultural and the nearest neighbors were over a mile away in any direction. Elena had to agree to extensive safety protocols that were far more stringent than typical exotic animal permits, including double fencing with specific height and strength requirements, documented emergency response plans that involved local animal control and law enforcement, regular unannounced inspections by wildlife authorities, and liability insurance that cost more than her annual salary and required her to mortgage her property to cover the premiums. She had to provide comprehensive documentation of Freedom's physical condition and medical prognosis and psychological state to prove that he genuinely required specialized hospice care that could not be adequately provided in a standard sanctuary setting where staff had to divide attention among many animals. She had to submit to criminal background checks and financial audits and home inspections and demonstrate through extensive documentation that she had adequate resources and experience and commitment to provide appropriate care for the remainder of Freedom's life, however long that might be. But eventually, after months of bureaucratic obstacles and skeptical officials and concerned neighbors who were convinced someone was going to get killed and the property values were going to plummet and dangerous precedents were being set, Elena received the permits she needed and began construction of what she thought of as Freedom's retirement home. The enclosure was designed by a specialist in exotic animal facilities who had worked on projects for zoos and sanctuaries around the world, covering approximately 1 acre of Elena's 5-acre property with specifications that balanced Freedom's needs for security and Elena's requirements for legal compliance. The design included both open space where Freedom could move around and experience sunshine and fresh air and natural elements, and smaller sheltered areas where he could retreat when he needed to feel the security of walls around him and a roof overhead. There were mature trees that provided shade during summer heat, large rocks and elevated platforms for basking in sunshine, a heated and insulated shelter for harsh winter weather, water features that could be filled for drinking and cooling, and enrichment items recommended by behaviorists who specialized in traumatized exotic animals. Everything was designed with Freedom's specific limitations and preferences in mind, creating a space that prioritized his comfort and sense of safety over aesthetic considerations or what a typical lion enclosure was supposed to look like. The transport from the veterinary facility to Elena's property took place on a cool morning in October, nearly 8 months after the night Elena had first looked into Freedom's eyes and made promises she was now in a position to actually keep. Freedom rode in a specially designed transport crate in the back of a large van that had been modified specifically for moving large exotic animals safely, sedated just enough to prevent panic and dangerous thrashing but aware enough to process what was happening and maintain some connection to his environment. Elena rode in the back of the van with him despite the driver's concerns about safety protocols, sitting as close to the crate as the configuration allowed and speaking softly the entire 40-minute journey, providing a familiar voice in an unfamiliar and potentially frightening situation, maintaining the connection that had become the foundation of Freedom's ability to cope with change and uncertainty. When they finally arrived at the property and the transport crate was carefully positioned at the entrance to his new enclosure using equipment that allowed for precise placement, Elena held her breath and felt her heart pounding as the door was opened and Freedom was given access to more space than he had experienced since being captured as a young cub nearly 17 years ago in circumstances that had never been fully documented but that almost certainly involved his mother being killed by poachers or trophy hunters. He did not move for several long minutes that felt like hours to everyone watching, standing at the threshold of the crate and looking out at the acre of land that was now his territory for the rest of his life, trying to process what his eyes were seeing and his instincts were telling him about this new environment that defied everything his experience had taught him about how the world worked. Then slowly, with the same trembling caution and obvious terror he had shown during that first breakthrough moment at the veterinary facility, he stepped out of the crate and onto the grass and earth that had been prepared for him. His head swung from side to side in wide arcs as he took in the trees and the grass and the sky that was visible above him without bars or canvas or any of the typical circus barriers blocking his view of the natural world. He walked a few careful steps, stopped to smell the ground and the air, walked a few more steps, his body language broadcasting confusion and uncertainty and fear about this situation that did not match any template his brain had for understanding his environment. Elena watched from outside the enclosure, giving him space to explore without the pressure or stress of human presence inside his territory, but ready to intervene with tranquilizer equipment if he showed signs of severe distress or panic that might result in him injuring himself. What happened over the following hours would become the defining pattern of their relationship for the years to come, a rhythm that would structure their daily interactions and create a bond that neither of them had experienced before. Freedom explored his new space in careful increments, checking every corner methodically and testing every boundary as if looking for hidden traps or dangers, but always returning to the spot closest to where Elena stood outside the fence. He would venture out a short distance to investigate something new, a tree or a rock or the water feature, then return as if checking that she was still there and had not disappeared or abandoned him before he felt secure enough to continue exploring. By evening, he had claimed the covered shelter as his preferred spot for resting, but he had positioned himself deliberately at the front of it where he could maintain visual contact with the main house where Elena lived, maintaining line of sight even as he settled down for the night. That first night, Elena did not sleep in her comfortable bed inside her house despite her exhaustion from the stress and effort of the day, but instead pulled a chair onto her porch and sat there wrapped in blankets and drinking endless cups of coffee, unable to bear the thought of Freedom waking up alone in his new space and finding that she had disappeared without warning or explanation after promising him safety and consistency. Over the following weeks and months, Freedom's quality of life improved in ways that made Elena cry with relief and gratitude every time she noticed another small sign of healing or comfort or contentment. He began to put on weight gradually as his appetite increased in response to regular feeding and his body finally had enough nutrition to rebuild what malnutrition and starvation had destroyed, his ribs becoming less visible and his muscles filling out and his coat developing a healthier shine. He started spending more time outdoors voluntarily rather than staying huddled in the shelter, seeming to enjoy lying in patches of warm sunlight or watching birds and squirrels and other wildlife that ventured into or near his enclosure. Most remarkably to the behavioral specialist who came periodically to assess his adjustment, he began to vocalize more frequently and in a wider range of sounds, not full roars because the trauma that had suppressed that behavior ran too deep to fully overcome, but soft chuffs and low rumbles and medium volume calls that seemed to indicate contentment or at least comfort. The kinds of sounds that healthy lions make when they feel safe enough to communicate something other than distress. But the most significant change, the one that convinced Elena she had made the right decision despite all the complications and controversies and criticisms, was in how Freedom related to her as an individual rather than just as a source of food or security. Elena spent hours every single day in his enclosure, initially just sitting quietly on a bench she had installed while he rested or went about his routine, building trust and comfort through consistent presence rather than forcing interaction or trying to manipulate his behavior. As weeks turned into months and seasons changed from fall to winter to spring, Freedom began initiating contact rather than just accepting Elena's presence passively. The behavioral specialists who consulted on Freedom's care were fascinated by the bond that was forming between them, noting in their reports that Freedom was displaying attachment behaviors typically seen only in lions who had been hand-raised from early cubhood by specific humans, not in adult animals who had experienced years of abuse and had every reason to distrust all human contact regardless of how gentle or consistent. The depth of Freedom's attachment to Elena, and her attachment to him, which was becoming impossible to classify as purely professional or altruistic, raised questions that made everyone involved somewhat uncomfortable. Was this healthy bonding that provided psychological benefits to a traumatized animal, or was it dependence and trauma bonding that trapped him in a relationship he would not have chosen if he had other options? Was Elena providing hospice care that allowed Freedom to live his final years in comfort? Or was she keeping him in a beautiful cage because she could not let go of her own need to save him? These were questions without easy answers, questions that required acknowledging legitimate ethical concerns while also honoring the reality that everyone involved could see, which was that Freedom was demonstrably thriving in ways that would not have been possible in any standard sanctuary placement. The question that haunted Elena personally, the one that kept her awake at night and made her question whether she had made the right choice despite all the evidence that Freedom was improving, was whether he was happy or simply dependent, whether the attachment he showed was healthy bonding or learned helplessness dressed up as affection. She consulted with experts who gave her conflicting answers that reflected different philosophical approaches to animal welfare, some insisting that a lion living on private property could never truly have his welfare needs met regardless of how excellent the facility was or how deep the bond with his caretaker. Others arguing that Freedom's individual history and specific needs made traditional sanctuary placement inappropriate and potentially cruel given his psychological state and attachment patterns. Elena read everything she could find about trauma in exotic animals, about bonding and attachment in lions, about the difference between healthy relationships and dependencies, trying to find clear guidance in situations that resisted simple categorization. The answer to her uncertainty came 18 months after Freedom had arrived at the property, on a day that started with a careless mistake that could have ended in tragedy and changed everything. Elena had been working inside Freedom's enclosure as she did every day, performing routine maintenance and cleaning and refreshing water features while he rested in his shelter as he usually did during midday heat when activity was uncomfortable. The routine was familiar and safe, something they had done dozens of times without incident or concern, a pattern so established that Elena had perhaps become too comfortable and less vigilant than safety protocols required. But on this particular day, Elena made an error in judgment that she would replay in her mind for years afterward with the kind of horrified disbelief that comes when you realize how easily disaster can result from momentary inattention. She left the enclosure to retrieve a tool she had forgotten in her garage, and in her distraction and haste to complete the task before the afternoon heat became unbearable, she did not properly secure the gate behind her. It was not completely open, just unlatched, held closed by gravity and the slight downward angle of the gate but not by the heavy-duty lock that was supposed to engage every single time anyone entered or exited without exception. Elena was inside her house, searching for the tool in her cluttered garage that desperately needed organizing, when she heard her neighbor's voice calling her name with rising panic and urgency that immediately triggered every alarm instinct she possessed. She ran outside still holding a wrench she had not actually needed, ran toward the front of her property in the direction of Marcus's voice, and found him standing at the edge of her driveway with his phone in his hand and fear written clearly across his weathered face. Marcus was the retired farmer who lived on the property adjacent to hers, a quiet man in his 70s who generally minded his own business and had been supportive rather than hostile about Freedom's presence despite initial concerns. "Elena," he said, his voice tight with the kind of control people use when trying not to cause panic but unable to hide their concern completely, "your lion is out. I just saw him heading toward the road. I did not approach him, just called you immediately like you told me to do if there was ever a problem." The next 15 minutes were the longest of Elena's life, longer than the night she had waited to see if Freedom would survive his first veterinary examination, longer than the months of uncertainty about whether permits would be approved, longer than any rescue operation she had conducted in 20 years of activism. She grabbed the emergency tranquilizer equipment that she kept stored in her house for exactly this situation that she had hoped would never happen, called the emergency response team whose number was programmed into her phone as part of her permit requirements and legal obligations, and ran toward the front of her property where Marcus had indicated Freedom was heading. Her mind was racing through worst-case scenarios with the kind of vivid detail that terror produces, imagining Freedom being hit by a car or wandering into a populated area or attacking someone's livestock or encountering a person who panicked and shot him, any of which would result in his death and her facing criminal charges and her entire organization being compromised and every animal she was trying to save suffering because she had been careless with a gate latch for literally one moment. She found Freedom at the end of her long gravel driveway, sitting calmly on the ground about 20 feet from the rural two-lane road that ran past her property, positioned in a way that allowed him to see both the road ahead with its occasional passing vehicles and the property behind him where Elena was now approaching. He was not attempting to leave or explore the world beyond Elena's land or escape to the forest that bordered the other side of the road. He was simply sitting there, positioned exactly as he would sit in his enclosure when watching birds or waiting for Elena to finish a task, as if he was weighing options or contemplating a decision about something important or simply enjoying a different view. When Elena approached slowly with the tranquilizer gun in her trembling hands and her heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe or think, Freedom turned his massive scarred head and looked at her with eyes that held no wildness or aggression or fear or any indication that he planned to bolt. He made the soft chuffing sound that he used exclusively as a greeting for her, stood up with the careful movements of an elderly animal whose joints were always a little stiff from the poorly healed fractures, and began walking slowly back toward his enclosure as if he had simply been out for a supervised stroll and was now ready to return home. Elena followed at a safe distance that allowed her to intervene with sedation if needed, hardly able to believe what she was witnessing and expecting at any moment for him to bolt into the trees or change direction toward the road or do any of the things that logic said an animal would do when presented with an escape opportunity. But he walked steadily and deliberately back to his enclosure, following the path they walked together every evening, paused at the gate that was still unlatched and hanging slightly open, and looked back at her as if waiting patiently for her to open it properly and let him enter. Elena secured the gate after he was safely inside, double and triple checking the latch with hands that were shaking so badly she could barely work the mechanism properly. Then she sat down on the ground outside the fence and cried with a complicated mixture of relief and residual terror and something else that took her several minutes to identify as profound wonder. Freedom had been given actual freedom for the first time in his conscious memory, an open gate and clear path to escape the enclosure that was still ultimately a form of captivity, no matter how comfortable Elena had tried to make it or how much better it was than a circus cage. He could have run. He could have explored the extensive forest that bordered her property or tried to find the open savanna that his deepest genetic instincts insisted was his proper home and natural habitat. But he had not run. He had not even tried to run or tested the boundaries of how far he could go. He had walked to the edge of the property line, and then, when Elena appeared with her scent and her voice and her presence, he had turned around and come back to the enclosure voluntarily, making an active conscious choice to return to what she had convinced herself might be just another kind of cage, even if it was comfortable. That was the moment Elena finally understood with absolute clarity that freedom was not dependent on her out of trauma or learned helplessness or lack of better options or conditioning that prevented him from recognizing opportunities. He was choosing her, choosing the routine and the safety and the relationship they had built over months of patient trust building and consistent care. He had been given a genuine chance to leave, and he had decided consciously that this life, with this person in this place, was better than whatever uncertain possibilities lay beyond her property line in a world he did not understand and that had never shown him kindness. It was not the freedom Elena had imagined giving him when she made that promise in the circus cage 2 years earlier. It was not running across African savanna or hunting prey or living in a pride with other lions who spoke his language. But it was a choice he was making consciously rather than having imposed upon him by circumstances or human decisions about what was best for him. And in a life where nearly every choice had been taken away from him for 17 years, where every decision about when he ate or slept or moved or performed had been controlled by others, the ability to choose it all, even if he chose captivity with someone he trusted over freedom without support or security, was itself a form of liberation that Elena had not understood was possible until witnessing it firsthand. The story of Elena and freedom attracted significant media attention despite her efforts to keep their unusual arrangement private and maintain focus on the broader mission of animal rescue rather than on one individual case. Local news outlets picked up the story of the woman who had rescued a circus lion and received special permission to keep him on her property for hospice care. And the coverage spread to regional media and eventually to national outlets and even international animal welfare publications that saw human interest potential and broader implications in the relationship between an animal rights activist and the elderly lion who refused to leave her side. Elena was initially resistant to the publicity, worried legitimately that it would create problems with her organization's mission and credibility or generate criticism from people who believed that lions should only live in sanctuaries or wild spaces, never on private property regardless of the circumstances or individual needs. But the response was overwhelmingly positive and supportive, with thousands of messages from people around the world who were moved by Freedom's story and who saw in his relationship with Elena a powerful example of how healing could take forms that did not fit conventional models or standard approaches to animal welfare. Teachers requested permission to share the story with their students as an example of compassion and second chances and individual solutions to complex problems. Therapists working with trauma survivors and humans saw powerful parallels between Freedom's gradual recovery process and the paths their own patients walked toward healing. Conservation organizations that had been initially skeptical about Elena's decision to keep Freedom on private property instead of placing him in a licensed sanctuary began to acknowledge publicly that maybe there were situations where standard protocols were inadequate and individual solutions were not just acceptable but necessary and possibly superior for specific cases. Documentary filmmakers approached Elena about telling Freedom's complete story, from the circus raid to the veterinary facility to the property where he now lived, filming over an extended period to capture the reality of their daily life together rather than creating a sensationalized narrative. She agreed reluctantly after extensive negotiations about editorial control, concerned about exploitation but also recognizing that Freedom's story had educational value beyond just their individual relationship, that it could change how people thought about rescued animals and what appropriate care might look like in complicated situations that resisted simple categorization. The documentary, titled Freedom's Choice, in recognition of that pivotal moment when he had chosen to return, was released 3 years after Elena had first found Freedom in that circus cage, and it won multiple awards for its intimate portrayal of trauma and healing and the bonds that form between species when circumstances allow for patience and genuine care that prioritizes individual needs over institutional convenience. One of the most powerful and frequently discussed sequences in the documentary showed Freedom's daily routine on Elena's property in detail that allowed viewers to understand the quality of his life and the nature of their relationship. The early morning hours when he would emerge from his shelter and make specific vocalizations toward Elena's house until she came outside to greet him, establishing contact that seemed to anchor his day. The midday time when he rested in shade while Elena worked on her laptop nearby, sometimes in comfortable silence and sometimes with her talking to him about her day or reading articles aloud. The evening hours when they would walk the perimeter of his enclosure together with Elena talking and Freedom listening with attention that suggested actual comprehension of her emotional state if not her specific words. Behavioral scientists who reviewed the footage carefully noted behaviors they had never seen documented in rescued circus lions in all the existing literature, including play behaviors with enrichment items that were typically completely suppressed by years of captivity and punishment, social engagement that went far beyond simple dependence or conditioned response to a food provider, and decision-making in response to options that suggested genuine preference rather than learned response to conditioning or training. As Freedom entered his 20th year of life, which was ancient by circus lion standards where the average life expectancy was barely into the teens due to abuse and inadequate care and stress, Elena began to prepare herself emotionally for the inevitable ending that came for all living things regardless of how much love surrounded them or how much more time seemed deserved. His health remained relatively stable due to excellent veterinary care and proper nutrition and the kind of stress-free environment he had never experienced before, but he was slowing down in ways that were impossible to ignore or explain away as temporary. He slept more hours each day, moved more carefully and stiffly due to arthritis in his malformed paws and poorly healed fractures, showed less interest in activities and enrichment that had previously engaged him. Dr. Chen conducted regular examinations and made continuous adjustments to his care plan and pain management to address the arthritis and organ function decline that came with age. But she and Elena both understood they were providing end-of-life hospice care now rather than rehabilitation toward improvement, managing quality of remaining life rather than working toward recovery. The conversation they had been avoiding and dreading finally happened on a cool morning in November when Freedom was having obvious difficulty standing, his back legs not responding properly to his attempts to rise from his sleeping position where he had been resting through the night. Dr. Chen conducted an examination using portable equipment and determined that neurological deterioration was progressing in ways that would continue to worsen, that Freedom was not in acute pain at this moment but that his quality of life was beginning to decline in ways that medication could slow but not stop or reverse. She and Elena sat in Elena's kitchen after the examination and talked about timelines and criteria and the impossible question of when compassionate euthanasia was the right response to suffering that could no longer be adequately managed through medical intervention. "How will I know when it is time?" Elena asked, her voice breaking on the question that had been haunting her for months as she watched him slow down. "How will I know if I wait too long and let him suffer because I cannot let go? What if I make the decision too soon and rob him of time that he still valued and wanted?" Dr. Chen reached across the kitchen table and took Elena's hand, and with the gentle authority that came from 2 decades of helping people make these impossible decisions about beloved animals, she said words that Elena would remember forever. "You will know because you have been paying attention to him every single day for years now. You know him better than anyone has ever known him, better than he might know himself. When the time comes, when he tells you through his behavior and his eyes that he is tired and ready, you will understand because you have been listening all along. Trust yourself. Trust him." Trust the relationship you have built. And trust that the love you have given him has already changed everything about how his story ends, regardless of when that ending comes. Freedom lived for another 6 months after that conversation. 6 precious months during which he continued to experience moments of genuine contentment and connection despite his declining physical capabilities that made everything more difficult. Elena modified his enclosure to accommodate his limitations, adding ramps where there had been steps, softer surfaces everywhere to cushion his joints, more accessible food and water stations positioned at multiple heights and locations so he never had to go far. She spent even more time with him than before, sitting beside him while he rested and talking to him about everything and nothing, creating a constant stream of human voice and presence that seemed to provide comfort even when he was too tired to respond with his usual attention and engagement. The end came peacefully on a warm spring morning when new growth was appearing on trees and birds were singing and the world was celebrating life in the way that spring always promised. Freedom had not eaten the previous day and had barely moved from his sleeping spot, and when Elena came to check on him at dawn as she did every morning, she found him awake but different somehow, as if some essential spark was already beginning to withdraw in preparation for what came next. She entered his enclosure and sat beside him, placing her hand on his scarred head, feeling the warmth of him and the slow rhythm of his breathing that was growing shallower. "It is okay," Elena whispered through tears that fell onto his fur. "You can rest now. You do not have to fight anymore. You made it. You survived everything they did to you and you got to live your own life at the end, and you got to choose love instead of fear. That matters. You matter. And I will never forget you." Freedom died with his head in Elena's lap, his breathing simply stopping between one moment and the next, his passage from life to death so gentle that she almost did not realize it had happened until the stillness became absolute. She sat with him for hours, unwilling to let go, until Dr. Chin came and found them there together one final time. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that healing takes many forms and love can exist in relationships that society does not always understand, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed a bond that defied expectations? Have you ever chosen to trust after trauma? Your stories matter. Please subscribe to Lion King Stories for more true tales that prove redemption is always possible when someone refuses to give up. Thank you for being part of our pride.